are of Texas. They understand firsthand the cost federal red tape impose on local communities and the advantages partnering with the private sector has on efficient policymaking. Through our oversight work, this committee has learned about the costly effects unfunded mandates impose on state, local, and tribal governments and the private sector. Last year, OGR received several hundred responses from governors, state legislators, and county officials regarding the specific federal laws and regulations, stalling their state budgetary flexibility and hurting local businesses. Countless accounts illustrated the heavy costs barely funded federal programs have on state and local governments. In the interest of your time, I'm simply going to mention states and territories rather than go into details on the specific examples. Tennessee, Alabama, Oklahoma, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands as territories. The Department of Education required the Virgin Islands to enter into a contract which reportedly cost more than $33 million between 2006 and 2016. This is a snapshot of the present problem unfunded mandates place on states and territories more than 2 decades after UMRA's passage. H.R. 50 will require federal agencies to undergo a more thorough regulatory process cognizant of costs on affected parties. This provision simply codifies Section 1 of President Clinton's Executive Order 12866 in 1993, which was reaffirmed by President Obama in Executive Order 13563 in 2011. For rules costing $100 million or more in 1 year, referred to as, quote, major rules, agencies have foregone the requirement to prepare written statements in cases where there was no notice of proposed rulemaking prior to the final rule. This was a loophole in UMRA that H.R. 50 closes. H.R. 50 requires agencies to prepare written statements to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs on all major rules, regardless if they've published a notice of proposed rulemaking. H.R. 50 also requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their regulations on the private sector and consult those affected entities as they would state, local, and tribal governments under UMRA. In the committee's recent hearing on unfunded mandates, North Carolina State Senator Jim Davis testified how costly federal regulations can be for local private businesses. An EPA enforcement officer ordered a business owner from his district to spend over $200,000 to reduce boiler system emissions from 12 parts per million to 4. The only problem, the technology doesn't exist to reduce it to 4. Instead of spending $200,000 on employees, raises, and equipment, he was left spending it on complying with the impossible. Many small businesses are concerned about the growing regulatory state. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, almost 45% of small businesses identify overregulation and economic uncertainty as significant challenges. H.R. 50 improves certainty for job creators. H.R. 50 will ensure transparency and consultation in the federal rulemaking process. I urge members to support this bipartisan bill.
The gentlelady from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
I thank the Chair. Mr. Chairman, I oppose H.R. 50, the Unfunded Mandates Information and Transparency Act. Despite its name, H.R. 50 amends the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, which was enacted as part of then-Speaker Gingrich's Contract with America. UMRA, the Gingrich approach, addressed a real problem, and it sought to strike a balance between the need for regulation and the funding burden placed on state and local governments. To strike that balance, it included some limitations that made a lot of sense. This bill repeals many of those limitations. For example, under this bill, agencies would be required to consult with regulated industry on a proposed major rule before the proposal is even made public. This means, for example, that if the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau planned to propose a rule to protect consumers from abusive mortgage practices, banks would get advance access to that rule and the opportunity to reshape it before consumers ever saw it. Or when the Department of Agriculture proposes a rule to prevent salmonella poisoning in chicken and turkey parts, ConAgra and Purdue would have the ability to influence that rule before even food safety experts looked at it. Businesses should have the opportunity to provide comments and propose rules that affect them, absolutely. And the current system does that. But they should do it through the normal public comment process as allowed under the Gingrich approach, just like other stakeholders. This bill would also put independent agencies in jeopardy of political interference. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act currently exempts independent agencies from its reporting requirements. This bill removes that exemption. That would mean that independent regulatory agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau would have to submit their rules to the Office of Management and Budget for review, which could undermine their independence. Section 12 of the bill would require an agency to perform a retrospective review, including an additional cost-benefit analysis of any existing rule if requested by the chairman or ranking member of a committee. The Congressional Research Service in 2015 found that there is an argument that Section 12 is unconstitutional. CRS said at that time, and I quote, "It could be argued that imbuing certain members, and not others, with the authority to demand that an agency prepare a report under Section 12 is an action of sufficient legislative character and effect as to trigger the bicameralism and presentment requirements of Article 1 of the Constitution." These flaws are all reason enough to oppose this bill. The most important reason is that we rely on agency rulemakings to protect our children, protect our workers, and protect our economy. It's also worth noting that in the 114th Congress, CRS found that this bill would result in direct spending of $18 million over 10 years, triggering pay-go procedures. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the bill at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 50, offered by Ms. Foxx of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment addresses a lapsed authorization within the committee's jurisdiction. Specifically, the amendment reauthorizes funds for CBO to perform its duties under the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, UMRA. The amendment reduces the authorization amount by $3 million because CBO was able to find ways to perform its duties related to UMRA at a lower cost. UMRA directs CBO to prepare mandate statements for legislation approved by authorizing committees. Upon request, CBO will also review intergovernmental and private sector mandates at other legislative stages. CBO determines if the mandate cost will be greater than the UMRA statutory thresholds. This amendment reauthorizes CBO's funding to CBO for $1.5 million from 2018 to 2024 based on its actual expenditures, which are currently around $1.3 million. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to address one of this committee's lapsed authorizations.
Does any other member wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from the District of Columbia. I saw both hands at the same time. Gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this committee will recall that soon after taking office, the President signed an executive order that created a regulatory reform task force. The task force was to, quote, evaluate existing regulations make recommendations to the agency head regarding their repeal, replacement, and modification, and identify regulations that eliminate jobs or inhibit job creation, or outdated, unnecessary, ineffective, or impose costs that exceed benefits. Mr. Chairman, these task forces have been have the potential to have wide-ranging effect on federal policy, including possible benefit to corporations and other interests. But the administration has apparently kept the names of these task force members secret, and therefore this committee and the Congress is unable to evaluate whether there are any conflicts of interest. There has been a recent New York Times ProPublica investigation that found that the task force members include, and here I am quoting, lawyers who have represented businesses in cases against government regulators, staff members of political dark money groups, employees of industry-funded organizations opposed to environmental rules, and at least 3 people who have registered to lobby the agencies they now work for. On August 7th, Ranking Member Cummings, along with several other members, sent a letter to OMB requesting the names of the task force members, and I raise this at this time because OMB has never responded. The committee staff held briefings with representatives from the task forces. When asked for the names of the task force members, several agencies actually refused to give them. On February 7th, 2018, ranking members Cummings, Nadler, Conley, and Cicilline sent a letter to a dozen executive branch agencies asking again for these names. To date, 6 agencies still have not provided names of their task force members. They are the Departments of Commerce, Homeland Security, Justice, Labor, State, and Small Business Administration. Mr. Chairman, our committee can, and I believe should, subpoena the names of these task force members. Our committee is about shining light and understanding government regulations. We need to know who exactly has influence in this administration when it comes to these regulations. So I'm asking you, Mr. Chairman, will you permit us to vote on a subpoena to ensure that the 6 agencies that I have just named provide this necessary information to the committee, noting that some of the agencies have provided names? Mr. Chairman?
Gentlelady, yield back.
I yield back and ask that you respond to my question, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman has not been recognized for the purpose of offering a motion to subpoena.
I asked, Mr. Chairman, not for a motion to subpoena, but will you permit us to vote on a subpoena to the agencies that have not responded? I'm asking you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not submitting a motion at this time.
The motion is improper as the item is not on the agenda. Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Illinois. Any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 50 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No. Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
On this vote, I would ask for a recorded vote at the appropriate time later today.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and a recorded vote is ordered. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for an opening statement on the markup.
I thank the chair. Mr. Chairman, 5 weeks ago, I sat in this same chair during our previous markup, and I asked the then chairman to let our committee take a vote on 13 different subpoenas. Unfortunately, that request was not honored. At the markup before that in November, Ranking Member Cummings asked for 6 motions for subpoenas, and that request was also ignored. Over the last 5 weeks, we have sent 13 more letters asking for new motions for subpoenas that we think necessary to ensure that this committee gets the documents and testimony we need to fulfill our constitutional duty, Republicans and Democrats, to conduct rigorous oversight. I expect my Republican counterparts will unfortunately once again ignore our need to vote on these subpoenas. We sent a letter Tuesday laying out each and every one of these requests, but to date have no response. Frankly, I just don't get it. I don't know why the choices being made to protect President Trump and this administration at the expense of our constitutional duty for oversight. It's in our committee's name. We're not the committee for protecting any particular administration or president. We're the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. I urge everyone to read the letters we've sent. We described each and every one of these requests in separate letters. We explain why these documents are crucial to our investigations, what steps we've taken to get them already, and why at this point we have no alternative but to seek subpoenas. As Ms. Norton just indicated, OMB's ignored a set of requests. Bad precedent. We understand the Chairman personally may disagree with our requests, but our committee members deserve an opportunity to debate and vote on these motions. That's all we're seeking today. For example, following many requests from Democratic members, the Chairman sent letters to the White House a month ago asking for information about security clearance processes, former Staff Secretary Robert Porter and his status, and the extent to which the White House officials have been working for extended periods of time with only interim security clearances. The White House response came a week late, and it completely blew us off. It provided none of the documents the committee requested, except for a memo issued by the Chief of Staff that was made public 3 weeks earlier. It's time for a subpoena. And, Mr. Chairman, to follow up with this public promise to interview key White House officials, including the Chief of Staff and the White House counsel, to which you've made reference in other venues. In another example, Jared Kushner has become a national security risk, potentially, that I don't think we can continue to ignore. He lost his top secret security clearance, but that was 14 months later. President Trump gave him access to the President's daily brief until just a few weeks ago, when public awareness of Jared Kushner's conflicts of interest and complicated financial dealings made it untenable to continue to do so. His personal financial interests make foreign governments believe, apparently according to press reports, that they might be able to influence him, one of which was Mexico, a country he led a delegation to just a week ago. We don't know if those reports are right or wrong, but we need to find out. That's our job. We asked to subpoena Mr. Kushner to testify before us if he's unwilling to attend voluntarily, but again, those requests have been ignored. For all of these reasons, I would ask to move that this committee authorize and issue subpoenas for documents and testimony on the 13 topics described in my letter with Ranking Member Cummings to you, Mr. Chairman, on Tuesday. The motion for consideration is at the desk, and I would ask for its immediate consideration.
The gentleman has not been recognized for the purpose of offering a motion to subpoena.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Might I inquire of the Chair, just when might this committee consider a motion for subpoenas on outstanding issues that we believe are worthy of our investigation?
I can't address that, although I will tell you I'm in receipt of your letters, and I'm happy to discuss those matters with you in the proper forum. This would not be that forum.
I appreciate the Chairman's answer. I will work with the Chairman, and I know Ranking Member Cummings will work with the Chairman to try to find a way to proceed. And I respectfully would inform the Chairman that on this side of the aisle, we will persist. I thank the Chair for his consideration.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and the gentleman yields back. The next item for consideration is H.R. 1339, the Freedom from Government Competition Act of 2017. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 1339 to require that the federal government procure from the private sector the goods and services necessary for the operations and management of certain government agencies and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Tennessee and sponsor of the bill, Mr. Duncan, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339 offered by Mr. Duncan of Tennessee.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. This is a bill that I introduced in the House and Senator Thune introduced in the Senate. At the first White House Conference on Small Business in 1955, a statement was produced which said, quote, "The federal government will not start or carry on any commercial activity to provide a good or service that can be procured from the private sector," unquote. Each White House Conference on Small Business since then has issued a similar statement or has listed government competition among the top 3 biggest problems facing small business. In response, many years ago, several groups came to me and asked me to introduce a version of this bill, the Freedom from Government Competition Act, at that time. In 1998, I worked with Senator Craig Thomas of Wyoming on this issue. A compromised version of this bill called the Federal Activities and Inventory Reform Act, or FAIR Act, passed into law. It was supported by both sides of the aisle, the business community, the government employee unions, and the Clinton administration. The FAIR Act requires every federal agency to look at what goods and services they are providing and determine if these are inherently governmental or commercial in nature. This act the FAIR Act had done some good, and we've made some progress because of that bill. However, several groups once again came to me in October of 2014 and asked me to write to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget and ask him how many federal employees were now engaged in commercial activities. President Obama's OMB director wrote back in January of 2015 and it said that according to the OMB, 1.12 million, 1,120,000 full-time federal employees were engaged in activities that are commercial in nature. This bill really, though, is not about, it doesn't require contracting out to the private sector just for the sake of contracting out. This bill is about getting the best service at the lowest cost for the taxpayers and giving small businesses a better chance in dealing with the federal government. I've had just about every type of business you can think of come to my office over the years and talk to me about government competition. These businesses range from high-tech ones like engineering firms and low-tech such as landscaping companies. This issue affects mapping and surveying companies, pest control companies, publishing and technology companies, laboratories, hearing aid dealers, alarm system operators, bus companies, and many, many others. In fact, 33 Washington-based national associations have endorsed this group, the largest being the American Chamber of Commerce, but it goes all the way down to the Virginia Small Business Partnership, the American Council of Engineering Companies, the Minority Business Roundtable, and many, many other groups. This bill proposes a very simple concept. If a federal agency is providing a good or service that can be provided by the private sector more efficiently and cost-effectively, we should contract out that good or service. If the federal government can provide that, if the federal government or a federal agency can provide that good or service at a lower cost, we should certainly allow that agency to continue to do so. And this bill does allow that department or agency to do so. This bill provides exceptions to the rule, including requirement by law that the function is to be performed by an agency, by agency employees if it is in the national security interest, that the function is done by the government, or if it is critical to the mission of the government for agency employees to perform the function, or if it is an inherently governmental function and in the public interest that it be performed by the government. Since 2008, there has been a moratorium on even studying these positions to see if we can save taxpayer dollars. And this bill will at least allow those types of studies and allow sort of a competitive procedure to be set up. Under this bill, the rule will require the head of a department or agency or the Secretary of the Department of Defense to periodically conduct a public-private competitive sourcing analysis of functions performed by that agency or the Department of Defense to determine whether to convert the performance of the function by the agency or department to a performance by a contractor. This bill really grew out of work by Dr. Gene Dodaro, who's been one of the most frequent witnesses in front of this committee and is the current head of the GAO. He led a study in 1998 looking at 1,661 cost comparison studies conducted by the Department of Defense between 1979 and 1986 and found that there would be savings of 27%, according to Dr. Dodaro, if there was more contracting out. A Navy report from 1996 showed the Department of Defense agencies conducting these cost comparisons yielded savings of more than 30%. The bill, importantly, takes into consideration agency employees that could be affected by these public-private analysis. The bill requires the head of an agency or department to consult with employees during the public-private competitive sourcing analysis and ensure that their views are considered. I think it's a good bill, and I would like to include at this point in the record the list of all of the groups and associations that are supporting this legislation, and I yield back.
Without objection, and the gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do thank Mr. Duncan for his effort in this regard. I'm not opposed to contracting out for government services. Quite the opposite. I'm a champion of it. I co-chair the Smart Contracting Caucus here in the Congress. I believe the question of insourcing versus outsourcing, however, must never be a matter of theology or ideology or prejudice. We ought to look at whether a service should be done by federal employees or by contracts on a meritorious basis. I believe that a service should be performed by the entity that can best provide service at the best price. For example, under the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Bill, which I co-wrote with our then-chair, Darrell Issa, federal agencies are required, in the interest of cost savings, to close or consolidate government-run data centers and move to the cloud in partnership with the private sector. And I have repeatedly expressed concerns that the 18F office within GSA seems to venture into the domain of the private sector, and that's an inappropriate role. I've opposed legislation that did the opposite of this bill, that presumed the federal government is always the most efficient provider of service. And I've sometimes stepped on toes in my own side of the aisle with some of the groups that support us in doing that, because it violated this principle of a prejudice about which is better. Neither is better. Neither is per se good or bad. It depends on the circumstances and the expertise and the cost. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute before us, claims that, and I quote, unfair government competition with the private sector of the economy is at an unacceptably high level, both in scope and in dollar volume, and that this unfair competition is detrimental to the United States economic system. That's a pretty sweeping statement. The measure doesn't offer a shred of evidence to support those assertions. And in fact, according to an analysis by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, federal employees comprised 1.9% of the nation's 144 million civilian jobs, hardly a threat to the private sector. And in that same year, the percentage of civilian employment in the U.S. comprised by federal workers equaled its lowest level ever recorded, far below its post-World War II average of 3.3%. So what is the threat we're trying to address here? I'm old enough to remember a few years ago, a Republican Secretary of Defense declared that outsourcing was too high for the Pentagon. They want to bring stuff inside. And I fought him on that because he couldn't justify that statement. What is too high? I defended outsourcing. But we have to be consistent here. We can't just substitute one bias for another. Proceeding from the unproven pretext, this bill would make major changes in federal procurement policy that would create new opportunities to reward political cronies and swing the door open potentially to corruption. And it would make these changes without providing for any expansion of the government's already strained acquisition force. There are several provisions of this bill that ought to be deeply concerning to members. None is more so than the provisions that would repeal the existing moratorium on the use of the A-76 process at military medical facilities. In 2007, this very committee held a hearing at Walter Reed to examine the neglect of wounded soldiers being treated there without, after experiencing or returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan. Many of my colleagues in this committee were there at that time. The committee's hearing revealed that a key factor creating the conditions, deplorable conditions at Walter Reed at that time, was the use of A-76 to require competition between government workers and contractors. The effects were multifaceted. When asked about a memo that seemed to warn that contracting out could even potentially lead to mission failure, then Army Surgeon General Kevin Kiley admitted that the A-76 competition process, which had been conducted over several years, had affected the workforce negatively. In addition, there had been a long period of time between the award of a contract and the date of the contractor actually beginning work, leading to an exodus of staff and a degradation of care for wounded warriors. It was the scandal at Walter Reed that led Congress to adopt the moratorium that we would now repeal in this bill. Fortunately, since the scandal at Walter Reed, Congress has repeatedly adopted, with broad Republican support, moratoria against the use of the A-76 process, both in the annual appropriations bills and in successive National Defense Authorization Acts. I urge my colleagues to reject this measure and to continue to uphold the decision already made on a bipartisan basis by the House in the past to reject the use of the flawed and faulty A-76 process at Federal agencies, including especially military medical facilities. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1339 offered by Mr. Farenthold of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Duncan, for introducing this fiscally responsible legislation. While I strongly support almost all of the bill, I'm concerned about the unintended consequences of its scope. That's why I've introduced a simple amendment to exempt the Department of Defense civilian employees at a depot or armory from this bill. The Army Material Command oversees 23 organic industrial base sites that include manufacturing arsenals, maintenance depots, and ammunition plants. Men and women all across the country work hard at these facilities to manufacture and reset Army equipment, generate readiness and operational capability, and, most importantly, with a fiscal analysis, save the government money. Our friend and colleague, Representative Russell from Oklahoma, has the privilege to represent the McAllister Army Ammunition Plant, which produces and renovates ammunition for our military. This plant employs nearly 1,500 Army civilians and generated a revenue of $215 million in fiscal year 2016. Located in the district I represent is the Corpus Christi Army Depot, known as CCAD, which is the most productive depot in the country. It's the largest industrial employer in South Texas with over 3,600 civilian employees, and it provides an annual local economic input of more than $2 billion. CCAD saves taxpayers millions each year by repairing and upgrading our helicopters for much less than the cost to purchase a new one. For example, to rebuild a UH-60 Blackhawk saves $9 million over buying a new one. Article 1 of the Constitution charges Congress with the duty to provide for a strong national defense. And while I'm confident of the ability of CCAD and other depots and armories alike to do their job in the defense of our nation in a cost-effective manner, this legislation would revoke the moratorium on A-76 studies that the House has just voted to maintain in January of last year. Additionally, Title 10 of U.S.C. 2466 provides what's known as the 50-50 Depot Core Law. Basically, this law provides depot maintenance be a public-private venture. The law says not more than 50% of the funds made available in a fiscal year to the military department or a defense agency for depot-level maintenance and repair workload may be used to contract for the performance by non-federal government personnel of such workload for the military or the Department of Defense. Any such formula that is not used for such a contract shall be used for the performance of depot-level maintenance and repair work by employees of the Department of Defense. The Code provides for the Secretary of Defense to waive this provision for reasons of national security, provided that the Secretary consult with Congress. This law has served our nation well. It's protected our national security industrial base by ensuring we have the organic capability owned and operated by the U.S. government. We must ensure that our U.S. government retains this capability for a number of reasons. It allows for us to have surge capability. It also allows to keep competition between the public and private sector and help keeping the pricing of the work that depots do, both public and private, at fair market rates. If we break this rule, what will occur is the private sector will have the opportunity to monopolize depot-type work and, most disturbingly, be able to raise their rates. Another issue I'm concerned about is the private sector may decide certain depot-level work or parts manufacturing is no longer cost-effective for them to perform domestically or at all, thus leaving the U.S. government in a tough situation in the event of war. Under this bill, without my amendment, the U.S. government depot system, which includes our arsenals and all of our industrial facilities, could become endangered. It's imperative that we keep our military depots vibrant, and it directly impacts our national security readiness. My amendment ensures that our depots are protected in a way that they must be to keep our aircraft and helicopters repaired and keep our warfighters ready in any event. The Congress serves the people of the United States and should therefore be continuously striving to improve their public service, not flip-flopping on important issues that could adversely affect the lives and security of our constituents who have trusted us to represent their interests across the globe. With this, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, providing safeguards and continuity for the civilians employed by our nation's depots and armories, and making sure our warfighters are well-equipped and prepared. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Mr. Farrenhall for his hard work. But basically, as I understand it, your amendment would add to that list of exemptions depot-level maintenance and repair, correct? And I am curious why public-private competitions are good for all of the other functions of DOD performed by civilian employees, except for the depot maintenance and repair.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Absolutely. I'm asking a question.
So there's the 50-50 rule that ensures that our depots work with the private sector. And in fact, many of the parts and work is done in partnership with the private sector. For instance, at the Corpus Christi Army Depot, there are various employees of companies like Boeing and Sikorsky there working with the depot and providing parts. It's a team effort in which is that 50-50 rule keeps the competition there not only between different private sector companies, but between the government and the private sector that keeps all the costs down.
Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it costs more with the 50-50 rule. So I'm really struggling to understand why depots are singled out for this exception, but why not medical facilities? Why not something else? You know, there's an article that I read last night in the Washington Post, it's in my mind, soldiers face neglect. And I'm quoting from it. There were signs of neglect everywhere: mouse droppings, belly-up cockroaches, stained carpets, cheap mattresses. You know, I could say, well, we should have an exception here too. So I'm opposed to it. I don't think you should start with the exceptions. I think we already have a public-private item going there. I'd like a cost-benefit analysis done before. Who knows, maybe having the private sector cooperate might even cost more money. So I am opposed to this amendment, and I yield my remaining time to Mr. Connolly.
I thank my colleague, and I just wanted to build on what she just said. It's my understanding, and I wonder if it's my colleague from New York's understanding, depot maintenance and repair is actually a term of art defined in law in 10 U.S. Code 2460. Is that her understanding as well?
That's my understanding.
And that term of art only covers part of the work performed in depots. So, for example, not included in that definition would be lots of other parts of the rubric of core logistics and sustainment activities, such as planning, design, engineering, research systems integration, management, operational support, human resources, et cetera. So even putting aside the issue of, is it a good idea to start already before we've even considered the bill for a vote, we're going to have carve-outs. The carve-out identified is problematic given the fact that the definition of depot maintenance and repair is not all-encompassing. And so we're going to have trouble on the ground, in an arsenal, in a depot, trying to figure out which part is carved out and which part is not. And I yield back to my friend from New York.
Thank you very much. You raised a very valid point. I don't think we should get ourselves all tied up in knots trying to have these carve-outs. I'm opposed to this amendment, and I think that I appreciate his hard work and his earnestness on it, but it's the underlying bill is also flawed, but this makes it even more difficult, and I don't think we should get into the area of doing carve-outs. It just makes it more complicated, and particularly this one has problems. And I yield back.
The gentlelady from New York yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the amendment and the underlying bill, and I sincerely want to thank Mr. Duncan for his leadership on this issue for years, and for the committee taking it up here, and my friend from Texas for the amendment as well. Look, I mean, the bottom line with all of this is, if an agency is doing something that the private sector can do, oftentimes at a much lower cost and more efficiently, then they should be able to do so. And of course, if the government is able to do that same job efficiently and at the best cost, then they should be able to do so as well. But this opens up competition, and no question will save money. And within that, there are some activities that the government alone does best, and they need to do so, such as national defense and law enforcement. And those types of things should not be done by the private sector, and they're not included in this legislation. But we have over 1 million full-time federal employees that are engaged in commercial activities. That's a lot of people who are duplicating activities that are already provided in the private sector. And so all this bill does is allow for competition between the agencies and the private sector as to who can do a better job, and that helps the American taxpayer, which is our responsibility here to look after, to watch out for. And so, I think state and local governments have already accepted this wisdom. It's long past time for we to accept the same thing here in the federal government, and I urge my colleagues to support both the underlying bill and this amendment. Let's keep the taxpayers in mind and the best interests of our country in mind, and I urge support of both of these, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a representative of an Army depot, the Tobyhanna Army Depot in northeastern Pennsylvania, I can't stress enough my opposition to my colleague from Texas's amendment. Quote, depot maintenance and repair, unquote, is a term of art that is defined by Title 10, United States Code, Section 2460, and covers only part of the work that is performed in depots, and hardly any of the work performed in arsenals or ammunition plants or the rest of the organic industrial base. It does not cover or include very crucial core logistics and sustainment work, such as engineering, systems integration, planning, program support, or even management and admin, and the multitude of vital supply and manufacturing activities, plus IT functions performed at a depot on a daily basis. We have firsthand experience with what happens to depots when they receive a carve-out. The last time they got one was when the Senate gave a carve-out on something, and we wound up with a compromise in the final bill where depots ended up with a worse deal than anything else in the Department of Defense. There are countless reasons why everyone should be exempt from A76, but depots always end up at the short end of the stick because organic industrial facilities are the one place where DOD can, quote, study, unquote, or compare, quote, unquote, numerous civilians at one time due to the fact that that is where there are large numbers of civilians employed compared to the military. Now, I've spoken with the American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, and their representative, who specifically works to cover depot issues for Tobyhanna Army Depot, and I can assure you this amendment does not have their support. In fact, I received a copy of AFGE's opposition letter to the bill this morning. It is a letter from Mr.